Is the SAVE Act a superhero saving our elections or a villain making it harder to vote? Let's unravel this mystery. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Beyond the Bill Number. Today, in the second part of our double header on non-citizen voting, we're diving into the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act, or the SAVE Act. If you haven't already, make sure to check out last week's episode looking at voting rights in DC. Stephen, ready to get into it?
Absolutely, Sarah. Let's save democracy one podcast episode at a time.
Before we get into things, let's talk about IDs. Here in the States, we've had a massive movement over the last few years of implementing this thing called Real ID, which essentially are majorly advanced IDs with all sorts of high tech and holographics and all these kinds of things. And like here in Colorado, we have a mobile app where you can like click on your ID. The columbine, which is our state flower, expands and grows, and it's a whole ID situation. But do you all have that kind of ID regulation in the UK? I've been very perplexed about, the movement towards it in general.
Well, so in the UK, we were always very similar to Americans in this, in that we are highly suspicious of any form of nationally mandated ID. So we've never had anything that resembles an ID card. But that's very unusual in Europe. Most European countries have some form of national ID card. It's just what countries do, actually.
Yeah.
So America and Britain were outliers in terms of not having these kinds of ID. And again, when we're in the EU, that's a problem now. When we're in the EU, this was a real issue. So if you want to fly within the EU, for example, you don't need a passport. If you're from an EU member state, you're allowed to just travel with your ID card. It's a bit like if you're flying within states in the US and so on. And for lots of other things, it was really helpful to be able to identify yourself using a national ID card. Now, this was an issue. So way back in sort of probably the early 2000s, actually, under the last Labour government, one of their big projects, so towards the end of their time in government, was to introduce a national ID card. And they spent probably about £1 billion on it over a number of years. It ran into all sorts of problems, all sorts of technical difficulties. Also, people were violently opposed to it. It's sort of strange, actually, because we usually don't get worked up about such things over here. Things like privacy and so on. We're quite relaxed about it. So Europe was much more on this than we were. In Britain, we're always quite relaxed. We're the most surveilled state in the world. If you're ever in the UK and you're walking around any kind of city centre or any road, just look up and you will see a camera pointing at you. Right?
The CCTV, right?
Yeah. Everywhere. Yeah, CCTV or traffic cameras. We've got all these license plate recognition technology all over the place. They're introducing this, facial recognition for crowd control and all those kinds of things. And people just don't care, right? But for some reasons, the ID cards really sparked people off, and it all collapsed. And it was quite an embarrassment for the government. They had to just abandon it, and they wasted all this money.
Gosh.
So no one has dared touch it since, because it was such a poison chalice at that point.
Wow.
But now, actually, it's coming back. Similar to the US, there are now murmurings about maybe we do need it, because technology has moved on so much since then that we're in a completely different world than we were back then, where actually having a way to identify yourself is really important. And the technology that they were talking about back then is now ubiquitous and quite simple and much cheaper. So it'd be much easier and cheaper to do it. Plus identity theft, that wasn't a thing back then, but now it is. And so having a proper ID card can really help sort of protect against identity theft if you get it right. But obviously there are privacy concerns as well. Do you want, say, a chip in your phone or your card or whatever you have that allows the government to track you or to track your financial transactions or whatever? So it has to be done right.
So I remember this in Spain, but in the UK, do you guys all get numbers when you're born, right? Like kind of like our social security number, but you all use them as identifier numbers. They're not supposed to be secretive. Like if someone finds out your social security number in the US, it's like, oh no, I don't want them to know my number. But in Spain, they use the numbers everywhere. Do you guys use your numbers for identification, or how does that work?
Not really. We don't really have anything like that. And they
Okay.
various. So, for example, we have a national health service,
Hmm.
and so everybody is part of this national health service. And obviously, you need some way of identifying people within the system, IT systems that allow
Yeah,
your
yeah, yeah.
records to be transferred to docs, all that kind of stuff. And it's really hard because we didn't have a kind of identifier. So now we all
Hmm.
have like an NHS number. No one knows what their
Ah,
number is, but that's the sort of thing
okay.
that follows you around. So we sort of introduced that for healthcare, but we
Interesting.
also have a national insurance number which
Okay.
you get when you turn 18. Or obviously if you become a citizen, you get a national insurance number, and that's for like tax purposes and financial purposes and that kind of thing. And it's often used as an identifier, so the banks won't
Okay.
know it and that kind of thing.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's
yeah.
the sort of thing that it's not secret in any way, but you tend not to give it out because obviously identity theft. The more
Yeah,
the
yeah,
more
yeah.
numbers people know about you, then the more likely they are
Yeah.
to steal your identity. But it's similar to the US. We use driver's licenses as ID, but
Yeah.
obviously not everybody drives, and nobody has one
Right.
of them.
Right.
And no one's going to carry their passport around, is there? So what else do you have? I
Right.
mean, I just remember
Wow.
going to the cinema recently with my daughter, and we were trying to smuggle her into a film that she was slightly too young for. And they said, "Have you got any ID?" And she was like, "No, I'm 15. Why would I have ID? I don't have any ID." And you've literally got nothing on you. No, that shows your age. No, of course I haven't. Why would I have?
Yeah.
So, because that's this kind of thing, isn't it? You don't know. In another
Yeah.
country, you say, well, you should have an ID card and you have to carry it at all times.
Yeah.
So you can prove your age and your identity.
Right. That is so interesting. I had no idea. Happy I asked that question.
Yeah, yeah. I think people would be more relaxed about it these days. I think if the
Hmm.
government were to go, they won't because there's far more important things to do than spend an
Right.
enormous amount of time and money on something like that. But if they were to introduce it here, I think people would probably be more relaxed about it than they were in the past. Okay, well, let's get back to business then. So we're talking about the SAVE Act. So what exactly does the bill propose?
The SAVE Act amends the National Voter Registration Act of 1993 to essentially require proof of U.S. citizenship for voter registration in federal elections. So, whenever you're registering to vote, you need to be able to prove that you are a U.S. citizen. It specifies that the acceptable forms of proof are real ID, like we have implemented all over the U.S. in the last few years. So, those IDs have either a star on them, but there's a way that you can tell that each person's ID is a real ID, or a US passport, or a birth certificate. And states will have to set up programs to verify citizenship, but the federal agencies will help out under the bill. There's also criminal penalties for election officials who register people who are found to have not been US citizens or given, bad data to the people and they get registered.
I mean, it seems pretty strict, but as I understand it, there are already lots and lots of states that have voter ID laws. So how is this any different?
Well, yep. 36 states already have voter ID laws, but the SAVE Act ups the ante by requiring proof of citizenship at registration, not just at the polls. And this is a big deal because only about 48% of US citizens have a passport, and few people have their birth certificates handy. I'm pretty sure my birth certificate is at my mom's house. I don't know where it is.
I
And driver's license and tribal IDs, which are common IDs, don't typically provide your citizenship status.
Got it. So, I mean, it sounds like it'd be a real hurdle for people to get over to actually register to vote, never mind actually going to the polls. So, what's the reasoning behind the bill then? I think it's Republican Chip Roy, great name. Chip Roy, he feels it's necessary.
Yes. Rep. Chip Roy and some other supporters argue that secure elections are crucial for a representative government. And so they believe that the current laws aren't enough to prevent non-citizens from voting, particularly with what they see as the open border policies and attack on election integrity laws that we've been seeing a lot over, especially the last 4 years, but even before that. And they claim that non-citizens voting is a really real issue, present, happening. And despite the existing laws in these 36 states and just kind of the general taste for voting of people who are non-citizens or what they're particularly concerned about, undocumented immigrants.
Yeah, so last week when we were talking about DC, we were talking about the fact that there are very, very strict laws against non-citizens voting in federal elections with
Hmm.
very strict penalties, big fines, prison sentences, that kind of thing. And also,
Hmm.
any immigrants who try and vote are deported, basically. So whatever their basis for being in the country is, it's revoked and they're actually sent back. So with those kinds of penalties, it does seem strange that you would feel the need to actually introduce more laws to
Hmm.
sort of prove these things. So what do the opponents of the bill say?
Yeah, so opponents, including House Minority Whip Catherine Clark, argue that there's no real evidence of this widespread voter fraud by non citizens. States like North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona have all audited their rolls and found very few cases of non citizens voting. The executive office of President Biden has also stated that this bill would make it harder for eligible Americans to register to vote and could lead to more eligible citizens being purged from the voter rolls, which again is, taking away the representation of people that this bill claims to be wanting to put forth. And when we look at the types of IDs that we have here, what's more common, and if it has your citizenship status on it, that's not the case. And the answer to it is not to have a citizenship marker on your driver's license, because we can all think of how that can, possibly unravel with the current state of things here.
Absolutely. So, I mean, it seems reasonable to claim that if you make it harder to register, then you're going to end up disenfranchising eligible voters and so on. So, are there any real world examples there? Is there any sort of data or evidence to back that up?
Yes, actually. Texas is a cautionary tale of what this could look like if it was put into practice. So in 2019, the Texas Secretary of State flagged 95,000 registered voters as potential non-citizens. And this led to lawsuits and the eventual resignation of the Secretary of State, because it turned out that many of these who were flagged were actually legitimate citizens. And it was kind of done carte blanche, and it became a huge issue. There was, talks of deporting people and all of this stuff. And it was actually like a pretty ginormous nightmare for the state.
Oops, that does seem quite messy, but I think it is a salutary lesson for other states, really, that it's often quite hard to establish non-citizens who is a citizen and who isn't, really. But obviously, you could use that on the other side to say, well, if it's so difficult to establish, then maybe there's a lot more of it going on than we know about, really. So where does the SAVE Act stand now?
So the SAVE Act passed the House in July, on July 10th, actually, with 221 votes to 198. Interestingly, 5 Democrats actually joined the Republicans to pass the bill, so a little bipartisan representation there. But it's pretty unlikely that it will advance the Democrat-controlled Senate, and President Biden has already vowed to veto the bill if it reaches his desk.
Well, sounds like it'll be a major talking point in the upcoming election then.
Definitely. The debate over election integrity versus voting rights isn't going away anytime soon. We'll see this bill featured in ads and political messaging, with Republicans arguing that the Democrats who oppose the bill want to let illegal immigrants vote, and Democrats saying that the bill is merely intended to suppress their vote and cast doubt on the legitimacy of the election process. And like you were talking about before, when we see bills like this come up, it is often a side effect of the bill, whether it is the intention or not, that minority groups and people with less resources are the ones who are disenfranchised because they can't get the IDs that are required. They can't take the time off required to get the IDs. They can't pay for it. Their work makes it hard for them to be able to go and do whatever process needs to be done. And so this is something that we see as a very common side effect to legislation like this, whether it's the intent, because these types of groups often do vote Democrat, or just, a happy coincidence, possibly. It's an interesting question to propose.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tightrope, isn't it? Because on the one side, you have to protect your elections. It's super important that people have faith in elections. You can see what happens in other countries where people don't trust the electoral process. But on the other hand, you can't put barriers in people's way. And turnout in elections is already really, really low. I mean, depressingly low in a lot of cases. And so you need to make it as easy as possible for people to vote. So you really do need to balance those two things. Well, thanks very much for the deep dive, Sarah. And thank you to all our listeners for joining us. Remember to subscribe and stay tuned for more discussions on the bills that are shaping our nation. Until next time.
Thanks, Stephen. See you next time, everyone.